This super basic timeline breaks Mexican history into 4 easy epochs: the ancient Meso era or pre-Columbian era, Spanish colonial era, independence and revolutionary era, and post-revolutionary era. The ancient Meso or pre-Columbian era is by far the longest in our timeline. Mesoamerican civilizations are easily as rich and as complicated and as intellectually advanced as any ancient culture anywhere, including the ones that many of us are most familiar with, like Greece and ancient Egypt. While there were many, many cultures that contributed to the development and achievement of civilization in ancient Mesoamerica, we're going to concentrate on the 3 that most of us have heard of. And the Olmecs were the first to arise and were prominent from around 1600 BC to 400 BC. Now, take a minute and let that sink in. That's 1,200 years, 4 times as old as the United States currently is. And they probably needed that long to carve up and transport the giant heads that are probably the most easily identifiable aspect of Olmec culture. The smallest weighs 6 tons, and it's estimated that the largest weighs between 40 and 50 tons. The Mayans had an even longer history. Some don't ascribe an official end to the Mayan period until 1697 AD. Along with further development in architecture, mathematics, and astronomy, the Mayan would develop the most sophisticated written language in the Americas and a calendar system of extraordinary complexity and cultural significance, basically consisting of 2 spheres that interacted together and a new term only reset once every 52 years. Finally, the Aztecs, and they were the dominant group when the Spaniards arrived. They were a warring culture and something of the Borg of Mesoamerica. But they were more than warriors. They were amazing engineers and built Tenochtitlan, an engineering marvel and megalopolis. Many among the Spanish conquistadors would call it the most beautiful city they had ever seen. And then they destroyed it, as Hernan Cortez pulled off one of the most unlikely chapters in all of recorded history. You see, Cortez was ruthless and deceptive, lucky, and highly effective. With just a few hundred men, he would persuade critical native allies to join in a fight and conquer the dominating Aztecs. Cortez would capture and kill Moctezuma and ultimately subjugate the Aztecs and others, allowing the minority Spaniards control, first in central Mexico and eventually throughout all of Central America. Over time, the Spanish were able to entrench their political and economic control so deeply and so ruthlessly that the colonial efforts extended to much more difficult form of subjugation, cultural control. The Catholic religion and Spanish language did not completely supplant native ways, but beginning almost immediately upon the arrival of the Spanish and extending over 3 centuries of subjugation, these 2 worlds intermingled to form a society that was uniquely blended and singular in its cultural mixing. After 300 years, the Spanish colonial system would finally begin to diminish at the cry of a mostly unbelieving mestizo priest in the silver country of the Bajío region. Uttering an unapologetic condemnation of the Spanish colonial government in the relatively small town of Dolores, this priest captured revolutionary lightning in a bottle. The War of Mexican Independence would last nearly 12 years, but would end successfully for the rebels. Unfortunately, after the revolutionary victory, the next 40-plus years would see the emergence of tumultuous politics, with over 40 different presidents taking and usually quickly leaving office. Some were elected to the presidency as many as 4 times, making the cry for no re-election a standard in Mexico's political lexicon. Within 15 years, the Republic of Texas would break away from Mexico. Then the Mexican-American War would see more than half of Mexico transfer to U.S. dominion. After these losses, Mexico would see perhaps its greatest leader and a man of indigenous ancestry. Benito Juarez would struggle for equanimity in Mexican society and a stable democracy in politics. But Juarez would not live long enough to see his efforts for stability take root. Eventually, Porfirio Diaz, a dictator who stabilized the political arena, but at the cost of legitimate elections. He would reign for 35 years and would solicit copious foreign investments in Mexico, but these would do little to spread wealth to those in poverty and build a middle class. After 35 years, Mexico had had enough. There is just no simple way to cover the 10 years of plot twist, alliances, betrayals, realliances, ideologies, egocentric conflicts, and assassinations that make up the highly complex and highly intriguing Mexican Revolution. But such is the task that lie ahead of us. People, many people, were exhausted of Porfirio Diaz. Poor people in the South, led by the steely and cool Emiliano Zapata, had been gutted of their land holdings and wanted justice and rightful restoration of properties. Pancho Villa developed a persona broad and shady and would come as close to any as defining the ideal lo mexicano of his day. Many in the North found him irresistible. Men like Madera and Alvaro Obregón, the first and last presidents to reign during the revolution, would embody conservative impulses and a paternalistic disposition. And to prove how dangerous this revolution was, all four of these men would be assassinated, something I hadn't intended when selecting them as revolutionary icons to discuss. And they weren't the only ones. Factionally, some groups were ideological, like the Constitutionalists, mostly urban, highly educated, and middle class. Others, like the Científicos, who operated under the banner of modernity, espousing principles of scientific politics. But often their policies were a thin veneer for preserving traditional social and political strata, as was prevalent in the Porfiriata. So for 10 years, these divergent men, political factions, heroes and anti-heroes, did battle for control of the future of this country. Amazingly and somehow, Mexico would emerge from the death and destruction of the revolution. And over time, basic gains in government and economic advancement would begin to take root. It would take time, but this country is intimately familiar with the connection of past, present, and future. If anything here piques your interest, please consider subscribing, as I am newly retired, have made Mexico my home, and love reading and learning and sharing about this complex, contradictory, and captivating place in the world.